Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're wondering what we're doing here, you can go to officehours.global to find out more. First hour is general discussion about media and virtual production. Second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. Today, we're going to talk about gain structure. So, basically building up your gain structure across a live event is one of the most important things that you can do, and oftentimes one of the least understood. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about building a simple sync system with Isadora. We did this last week in labs, and I think you're going to see this more where we're figuring something out in labs and then bringing it back to office hours. And so we figured out how to build a little AV sync with a little video and Isadora, and we're going to just kind of walk through how that happens to hopefully introduce you to that. And then office hours update on Thursday. We're going to talk a little bit more about progress that we've made so far and where we're trying to get to. Hovercast will be joining us on Friday, so their team will come here and tell us what Hovercast does, as well as answer your questions. And then, of course, we have the long day on Saturday education. We're going to post that on YouTube, but that'll start at 8 o'clock. At 11, we'll be cooking with Damayanti Gajar. So we're pretty savory pancakes, which I'm pretty excited about. I've been eating the eggs that I made last Saturday every morning. So it's so good. So anyway, so that turned out really well. And then, of course, we're going to Todd Reynolds' house using the Belfast method at noon. So you get to see behind the scenes of how that works. There's a separate link in the emails that go out in the morning. So make sure to check that out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Bill?
We start with Ray Harward, west of Phoenix, Arizona. And Ray says, I'm a solo producer Windows shop, but really would like to use ZoomISO, which is Mac only. What learning curve should I expect? Can I buy a Mac Mini, install ZoomISO, grab audio through vMix, and just run with it?
I think that you can. I think that might be more of a. I'm not actually certain. I'm afraid that we're a Mac only shop, or not Mac only, but we're primarily Mac when it comes to office hours. We do have a lot of PCs. We haven't tried to mix and match them. So you should be able to make this available. I think that through something like Dante, you would definitely be able to do it as far as getting the audio out of that system. Dante virtual sound card should be able to, or even just little outputs, but physical outputs. But I think that that would probably be the easiest way to get back and forth. Let's jump to the next question.
Okay, we're moving on to Tim Holm. And Tim, if I can get my mouse in the right place, says, can OBS Studio generate NDI out? And if so, how is that done?
Go ahead, Rupert.
It sure can. It's a plugin though, so you'll need to go get that and install it. On Windows, it's particularly important to get the corresponding version for the version of OBS. So if you're running the 64-bit version of OBS, you need to make sure you get the 64-bit version of the NDI plugin. And then once you have it installed, the output options are in the tools menu. You can enable program and preview output there. And then also, if you want to, in a scene or a source, you can apply a filter to generate a dedicated NDI output for that scene or source. I haven't used it for a while, so I don't know if there's an NDI 5 version, but it's certainly an NDI 4.
Next question.
Jeffrey Powers in Madison, Wisconsin, here on the panel today, says thoughts on today's NVIDIA keynote, including Omniverse and AV Maxine for autonomous vehicles.
Jeffrey, you'll have to give us some commentary because we haven't seen it yet.
So early this morning, they did have they had a keynote. NVIDIA's got a 3-day conference going on. This is all dealing with anything in enterprise. So no individual desktop cards were introduced or anything like that. But they announced that they've increased some of the graphics power of their CUDA, and the term I can't think of right now, but the big things were the Omniverse and AV Maxine. Omniverse being the ability to bring video in and manipulate it. They showed a soccer game, and they actually took out the whole field for the soccer game. They kept the players in their resolution and stuff like that, which does not bode well for virtual backgrounds for Zoom, if that works. But the other thing is the autonomous vehicles, the Maxine, which was just amazing, being able to identify what's going on and predictively identify things. So like, for instance, if you go into a shopping mall or something like that, and there's first time you go in the shopping mall, it's going to be the road's going to be clear, but maybe next time a cart's going to be there. Maybe next time they're going to have pylons there or something like that. How it can figure that out and navigate around there. So a lot of great stuff for us in the AV area, especially when we're creating content.
Oops, I think you're muted.
Sorry, Alex.
I only had a small point. I was actually watching the video. I put the link into Mukana. The video starts off with 13 minutes of the walk-in state, which is interesting in the fact that they think that it's worth. They didn't actually fix that after 7 hours after the broadcast. It's just what their walk-in loop was like, and what they thought was good to be putting on there. I'm also interested in, which I haven't seen yet, what their attitude is towards their walled garden versus other ones. And
was it an actual live presentation?
I don't know.
It was live. It was live pre-recorded, so they put it out like at.
So they have a walk-in that they left up live.
Well, they're gonna replay it today in a couple hours. So I'm guessing that the first one they'll fix it the second time around.
That's a funny behavior to do it. Have 13 minutes of live. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I haven't seen it. I was going to ask Jeffrey if he saw anything, if they did anything on AI and noise reduction, since this is audio day, with their RTX system for their automatic noise removal.
Not only noise reduction, but they also, but once again, this is not on the desktop level. This is on the enterprise level. But they also are improving their speech conversion. So if you need to get something translated into German or different language, they've improved on that. I haven't seen the whole thing myself. I skimmed through it as quick as possible, but there's just a ton of stuff that they were talking about that's dealing with AI, and the noise reduction is one of them. Yeah.
Next question.
Graham Cardwell in Belfast, Northern Ireland is up next. He says, I've received a video that was shot in a bar. Have you any suggestions or plugins for fairlight that would help me reduce the background noise to improve legibility?
Go ahead, Jason.
Isotope RX is kind of the go-to standard if you don't want to spend too much money. I'm also a big fan of the old school Adobe Audition active noise filter. If you can get that noise floor and just tune it in just right, that can help a lot too.
Go ahead, Jeff.
A second for Isotope RX. This was a short video. I don't know if it was just a segment, but probably easier to pull that audio out and work directly in the Isotope app rather than trying to do it as a plugin, because you'll probably want to use a few different of their tools. And you can do that all within the app. And don't forget to look at summing to mono and see if you can get rid of some of the noise that way. That it seems you may get better dialogue out of this by summing to mono.
About 80% of the time that I've done this, that I've had to do something like it, it's been with Isotope. And then the other 20% when I can't get it to work in Isotope has been Synaptic Unveil, which has been relatively successful. It sometimes can be dig a little deeper than Isotope. So I don't use it out of the box. I mean, I don't use it first, but it can be effective when Isotope isn't. Next question.
From Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, here on the panel. And Rupert notes that Slack is hosting its annual user conference, Frontiers, they brand it, next week. A 2-day free digital event accompanied by 2 pop-up sessions in different cities, which they are calling interactive brand experiences. Is this an attractive model?
Yeah, I think that what we're going to grow into is a whole lot of pop-ups in different cities. I mean, this starts to make a lot more sense than what we've been doing with the hybrid model, which is that, hey, we're going to do something that's virtual for everybody. We're going to have viewing rooms for those virtual events inside of those pop-ups. And then the pop-ups themselves, though, have tons of other benefits. You know, you're going to get snacks and coffee and cookies, and you get to network with people and hang out with folks. But we're getting, the idea is to kind of get past the old, we don't need to film in the room anymore. We can just have rooms that you can go view it if you want to at the event. But the content itself, what I think people are slowly learning is the content itself wasn't what was drawing people to the conferences. I think conferences held onto that content like it was gold. And what it really was most of the time, when they did the other things well, when they had great catering and when they had great networking opportunities and places to interact with the engineers and people to talk to, people came for that, and might sit through some of the conferences. But so having those available, I think makes sense, especially if they're interactive with the audience that's there. But I think putting people in the room to speak undermines your overall digital experience, and I don't think it has a lot of benefit for the in-room. Next question.
Ray Harwood, who gives us a location is west of Phoenix, Arizona, says, is Mukana generally available? I like the full Mukana interface for panel Q&A sessions like this. Follow up, will it ever become a Zoom app?
It is. You can contact me. It's a little expensive and slow right now for us to implement it for someone to do. So it takes a little bit of time to get it working. But if you want to use it, you can contact me on Discord. We are working on the Zoom app, and we hope to have it ready to go by January. Next question.
Rupert McCrae here in the panel, Dallas, Texas again. CES 2022 is in January. Are any of the usual vendors already saying they will not be exhibiting?
I don't know if anyone's made any announcements yet. I think that, I've heard that they're still quietly smaller booths, and less. They're not necessarily getting out, but they're definitely not making the same investment they made in 2019. So I think that's what I've heard so far from folks around it. People expect, I think that what I've heard is 30 to 40% less attendees, which is still going to be a lot. So losing that many isn't it's still one of the biggest shows in Vegas with that. But we'll see what happens there. Next question.
Todd Raines is in Allen, Texas is up next. And Todd asks, follow up from yesterday to ProRes recording my video assist. My wood turning demos run 2 to 3 hours of continuous live capture. How do I calculate if my 256 gigabyte SD card will be big enough to record in either ProRes or ProRes HQ?
Go ahead, Alex.
There is a web app that'll do the calculation for you. You pick the codec and you pick the frame rate and the resolution, and it'll tell you how many gigabytes it's going to take up. So I just did this here, and I'll post it in Mukana. This is put on by Digital Rebellion, who do good tools for post-production. But if you type in ProRes HQ 1080, because it's a constant data rate codec, the frame rate 2997, 3 hours is 290 gigabytes. So I will recommend that you use ProRes, not ProRes HQ.
Yeah, go ahead, Roscoe.
Yeah, Aja has the exact same thing. It's the Aja data rate calculator application. It's in version 6, and it does the exact same thing. You give it how much media you have, or you give it what codec you want, and it'll do your calculations.
And I use the Aja one on my phone all the time. Like, is this going to be enough? The other thing to remember is that the cards are not very expensive anymore. So going to 512 will give you a lot more headroom if you do it that way. And again, I think that for turning, if you're not going to do a lot of color correction, I think you could get away with even LT. I think yesterday we talked about just not using proxy. Proxy is really not built for a delivery format. But LT probably for turning would probably be fine. If you want to do any kind of heavy color correction, then you'd want to go to HQ. Next question.
Next one comes from Chris Walker in Lafayette, Indiana. Chris asks, has anyone on the panel tried Dropbox Replay? And for those of us that only occasionally use such a service, would it be a good alternative?
I don't know enough about it. I have to admit, I have a Dropbox account that I'm desperately trying to get out of because it drives me absolutely crazy. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I don't use Dropbox and haven't for years because I once tried to take it off of my machine, and the hooks it puts deep into the OS, actually into the machine, were very difficult to get out of. And that's not saying there's anything wrong with the software at all, but it's just uninstalling it turned out to be like a 2-day hassle for me. And that's probably because I was distracted, but I don't like software that gets that deep into the machine.
And if you think that's bad, try uninstalling it from the web. Like trying to get all your data off the web. It's like one at a time, like every folder, piece by piece by piece. They don't make it, obviously, for good business reasons, they don't make it easy to get off. So I think they've made an extra $1,000 from me just because I'm trying to get it off and I can't. Like, it's just the downloads crash and a lot of other things. And so it is I would not use Dropbox if you haven't started already. Don't go there. it's not great. Next question.
Next one comes from Tim Holman, San Lorenzo, here on the panel. Anyone have a recommendation for a rear screen portable projector screen?
I have one. I have one. I was spelunking the other day in my garage, and I actually have one. I don't know how to see if I can find out what it was. I was like, where did this come from? I was like, we must have bought it for some random project. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So I've been, I have one that I actually got from Amazon that I have for my window, and I've been doing the rear projection for Halloween and of course for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I'm not exactly sure what your plans are, but for something like that, I can put that link in the show notes and you can give that a try. But once again, I need to know if you're doing something a little bit more than this to recommend anything.
Yeah, I have what I ordered, and I don't, again, it's not available anymore. It's an Elite screen. Elite makes one that was 195 inch 4x3, but it was a rear projection screen that I got for when I was living on a farm in Pennsylvania. I got one so that I could turn the backyard into a 5:1 theater. so that's it took me a little while to remember why I had that screen. Go ahead, Marty.
Portable rear screen it can be tough because you really need to have controlled lighting conditions, between the screen and the projector. You don't want to have like bright light or daylight or even a lot of ambient light behind the screen if you're going to do rear screen projection. So portable is kind of difficult to do.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, daylight makes some professional. Depends on what size you need. You can get them up to 10, 15 feet that come with frames that fold up and then scissor out, and they have stands and feet that support them. But like Marty says, it has to be done at night, and you have to limit any ambient light from falling on the back of the screen. Otherwise, it'll wash it out.
I will say it's a great crowd pleaser. We've used them around the world, blow-up screens mostly. So these are screens that are inflatable. The thing you have to deal with inflatable ones is the fan that keeps them up actually makes more noise than you would expect. And so you kind of have to figure out where you're going to put that to keep it away from it. And it just means that you need proper like good, solid speakers, to make that work. But we've done, I think the largest ones we put up are like 30 foot in diagonal. And the other thing you have to think about when you start putting these outside is which way the wind is going. So every time we've done it so far, we've been really fortunate to have the wind going in the direction that we needed it to. But if it went the wrong way, it's a giant sail. So you just have to kind of keep that in mind. And for the larger ones, you need large water, basically weights. So there's these huge tanks that you put out that you tie it to, and then you pour water into them and keeps them from flying away. So anyway, that's probably more scale than you need, but those are, check out inflatable projection screens. It's a really popular, especially there's some communities that do it, and then also for community events. And the other thing I just will say that we should probably do more research on, maybe even a second hour, renting popular films, especially ones that are a couple years old, not that expensive. You think it's going to be really expensive, but it's like $400 for a screening, and if if you have 500 people show up, it's not that big of a deal to do that. Next question.
Roscoe Jones, who gives his location as just north of Disneyland, says we had a show with 2 open HDMIs into an ATEM ISO, which could have been used for 4 tracks of audio. How would you get these 4 signals in? And he's interested in best quality versus low cost options.
Go ahead, Jason.
I've been thinking about this question, and it's not really clear to me if he wants higher quality audio of the camera or if he wants 2 separate tracks. Either way, I'd say the cheapest way to do it would be with a, what is it called? A Zoom SH6 or something. I think they work pretty well. Do you have a better idea, Alex?
Yeah, go ahead, Roscoe. You can
well, I want those 4 tracks, and I want the time code that comes along with those tracks so that we can go into post with 4 clean tracks. In this specific case, we needed tracks there was an orchestra band, about a 7-piece band in the background. It would have been nice to have clean tracks with them mic'd along with all the video that we were shooting.
And well, it seems that you could embed, and what cameras were you using?
We were using the Pocket 6As, and we embedded. We already used all the channels off those cameras. We already ran some XLRs for the vocals and for the QLab sound effects. We ran those into the cameras already. So we had these two open HDMIs, which is 4 tracks of audio. I just need a way to get good quality XLR line level audio into a ATEM mini ISO.
So you need something that's going to embed them into QuickTime.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be easiest to take them into post with the time code already there. We have other options to do multi-tracking, but I thought here's 2 open HDMIs. Why can't I just get a nice audio signal?
Do we know if the Extreme, if you have 4 embedded audio 4 embedded channels going into the Extreme, do we know if that will, like in one HDMI, because the HDMI is capable of 8 channels, will the ISO see all of those channels?
Yes, it will.
I think it only sees stereo. Will it see more than that?
No, it will see 2 per channel, so it's potential on an.
No, but what I'm saying is that because the HDMI feed is capable of 8, you know.
Oh no, it only sees 2. That iViper, it only records 2, and it'll actually ISO out the channels for you in the audio ISO folder.
Right. I don't know if it's the cheapest way to do it. The way that would be, if you could find used PIX 240s, they'll do that. You know, you could basically have 2 HDMIs go into the PIX 240. I have one right here. So the reason I was asking about that is because if you use AES, you could do 4 channels into the PIX 240 and, 1 PIX 240 and just feed it in. But if it's stereo, you'd need to do 2 of them. That is the most compact way to do it. I don't know if it's necessarily the cheapest way. They have kept their value pretty stable, but I think I've seen some on eBay for as little as $600 or $700 every once in a while. But that is that's the 240. Yeah. So you have that there. So that would be possibly one option. I can't think of another easy way other than getting cheap cameras with, the nice thing about the PIX 240s is you got great preamps, or relatively good preamps. The PIX E5s with the audio on the bottom have really good preamps.
You could use a Teranex embedder or a pair of them, but that'd be a little sloppy.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was going to go some used cameras. If you go like a Canon XA10, find those used on eBay. They've got decent quality line level, or if you need, they have mic preamps with phantom power right to the HDMI.
Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
There are a variety of audio embedders, HDMI audio embedders that are on the market. They range anywhere from the surveillance quality up to broadcast quality. If I can, I'll find some in my bookmarks and put a couple in Mukana.
That sounds good. For SDI, by the way, there is a relatively new box that'll do 16 channels of SDI from Dante, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but it popped into my head that is great for being able to just have a little thing that's got Ethernet and SDI and be able to embed and de-embed into SDI has been. It's like that's like $1,000 or $1,500.
Wait, so it goes Dante to SDI 16 in?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. If you search for it, there's only one of them. Like it was like we spent a decade going, why hasn't someone done this? And
it's going to cost me $2,000, Alex.
$1,500. Yeah, go ahead, Roscoe.
I was going to say the embedders are going to need some sort of signal, so I still have to come up with an HDMI signal because they won't just embed to nothing. They have to have a signal to ride on.
Yeah, that's why a cheaper camera might be better. Next question.
Rupert McCrae is up next from Dallas, Texas. He says Forrester Research predicts about 1/3 of the organizations will fail at hybrid initiatives. What might happen as a result of these failures?
Go, Jason.
I'm surprised that it's that low. I would say that they would lose engagement, they would lose potential engagement, and whatever engagement they had would be lessened. It's that simple.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm speaking to this only because I just came off of a run. I've come off of a run of enough different shows that I can speak to this, and no one will know for sure which show I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I've seen a few attempts at hybrid that were done really poorly, and I definitely walked away with the feeling that what they were going to end up doing was just not doing them anymore and just going back to doing live events with people as soon as they possibly could. Like, unfortunately, rather than looking at what it was they were doing and trying to solve the inherent pain points and make it a better thing, it was just, oh, this didn't work. Online doesn't work. I just want to go back to lots and lots of comments of we can hardly wait to get back to doing live events like we always did them before. I wish it was different than that, but that was unfortunately over the last month and a half my experience.
Yeah, I mean, people are always going to, especially when they fail, they're always going to want to go back to something safe. The fundamental problem, again, that we say over and over again, is that you're basically excluding 99.999% of your addressable market. And so as people get better at the digital events, they're going to just slowly. So the people who are hanging on to the physical events are going to slowly be outmoded. That's the reality of what's happening there. The real thing is that I think that a vast majority, I think it's more like 30% or 1/3 will fail. And then the other 60%, of them will just be lackluster, and people will be less likely to go again. That's really the thing that people have to take into account, is that people won't complain. They won't think that it was a disaster. They won't think it's bad. They just won't feel engaged to do it again. And that's the real danger of coming out weak in that process. And it's almost impossible to come out strong with a hybrid. Next question.
Jason Robert Shaw in Sarasota, Florida, next with recommendations for a sub $1,000 camera that could work in the low-level light conditions of a planetarium in lectures for use in streaming and Zoom programs. Any other thoughts on streaming and low light?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Jason, I like the Sony ZV E10. It's the next generation of the Z series, but has a larger sensor in it and removable lens. So I have a 1.8 on here right now. Should cover it pretty well.
Jason?
I'll give you kind of the hacker inexpensive way of doing this. Go with a low bandwidth light, a quiet red or a quiet blue, and then just get something like a Brio. That'll look pretty neat.
I'm not going to give you the $1,000 version because I don't know how you do it that well, other than what Mitchell just showed here. There's a lot of the Sonys kind of in the mid $500 range that with a really fast lens could probably get you pretty far. The two that are the ultimate low light for this type of thing are the Canon ME20 and ME200. The ME200 is $5,000, and I used to own 4 of those, and we used them for low light all the time. They go up to an ISO of I think 1.5 million or something like that. The ME20, which is 20 grand, just so you know it exists. I'm not saying you should buy it, but just so you know it exists, has an ISO of 4 million. We shot stuff that we couldn't see in front of us, and we were broadcasting it. so it is. I think that Brian remembers the hyenas. We didn't shoot it; someone else did. But it was very scary because we were like, I don't think that they understand that the hyenas are as close to them as they are. So anyway, because it was just jet black. So anyway, it's a. We've seen those in use, and those are the two. What they did is it's a 1080p sensor that they just left it as 1080p but full frame, so the photo sites are massive, and because of that, it's incredibly low light. So those are and then there's X27 series, but that's usually a different market. Next question.
Jim Hankins comes to us here in the panel from Chesterfield, Michigan, and asks, seeking recommendations for a wireless IFB setup for on-set talent for cooking shows. Prefers a solution that provides an option for detachable earpiece with support for 3 to 4 users.
Go ahead, Marty.
So there's a company called Voice Technologies out of Switzerland, and they're available from a number of vendors here in the United States. These are excellent IFB earpieces. They sound, the audio bandwidth is wider than most of the others, and it's also a lot cleaner, less distortion in your ears. They do have interchangeable earpieces. You can put custom earpieces on them. You could put stock earpieces on them. The driver is really small. It's like a little bit bigger than a grain of rice, and it just sits right behind your ear here. So it's really comfortable to use.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, it depends on how much money you're looking at and whether you need the actual wireless devices. The gold standard is Electrosonics IFBs. Those receivers are about $700 to $800 a piece, and the transmitters around $1,200. An alternative might be Comtex. You might be able to find some of these in the used audio equipment at True Audio or Location Sound. The Comtex 216s are the PR72s, which are the 72 megahertz. Those are all professional receivers. This is all professional equipment, and they all have just a headphone jack on them, like you see there, that you can plug any kind of IFB headset into. And this requires a transmitter, and then you can buy the individual receivers, as many as you need.
Go ahead, Brian.
I'm going to say the same thing that Roscoe said. Wireless continues to be a buy once, cry once situation. There are several lower cost things that are now being marketed on a regular basis, but I still just, buying the real stuff. And one of the things that is often missed is if you buy electrosonics unit, you can use it for 5 years and turn around and sell it for 20% less than you bought it for. It doesn't really cost you $2,500. It probably costs you $400 over the span of 5 years. And during that period of time, you'll have a thing that actually works every single time you plug it in. And so, yeah, I tend to just default back to what Roscoe said. The CommTech stuff is also good and, will work. But if you buy electro unit, it's very, very hard to break them. It's very, very hard to make them fail. Their IFB systems are, in my opinion, second to none. So.
Yeah, we've used a wide variety of things. I will say that my favorite, because since you didn't give me a price, my favorite is the Phonax. So the Phonax are the best. They are especially for a small space. They don't go very far, so they're not like Electro where you can get a long distance. But if you're cooking and you're in a constrained space, the Phonax they basically are little earpieces like you'd see in like Jack Bauer type earpieces that, again, are really solid at about 30 feet. So that's, and not solid after that. So you have to, but I'm speaking directly to a cooking environment. What I use for our little cooking events when I'm using an IFB is the Rode Go's, the Rode Go returns, and at 3 feet, they work great. So they, I think most things work really, really well. If you're going to do anything more exciting than cooking, then I think you want to go with Electro. If you're going to do something less, the X-Vive is another one that is got multiple channels and it's designed for that wireless system. But I used to have a Phonak. It got sold with my company, but it was a luxury of being able to just pop something in your ear and then just walking around and it just works. It's like people are in your head because there's no wire, no nothing to kind of manage it. Go ahead, Marty.
When we're talking about wireless IFB, there's also being careful about frequency coordination, just like you would if you were doing wireless microphones. And in that, the Phonax don't use the same kind of frequency spectrum that others do, and
they use the same frequency as the Comtrex.
As the Comtrex, which is a hearing assistance band in the 216
or 75
range, or 75.
Yeah.
There's an alternate brand that Electrosonics is starting to market called IFB Blue. I'm not sure what the price point is. I would expect it to be a little lower than their traditional product. There are some others, but just be aware that the frequency component, some may operate in 2.4 gigahertz, which is something you probably want to avoid.
Yeah, the one thing about 2.4 is if in a cooking is just don't use the microwave.
Exactly.
It'll cut out real quick. Next question.
Tim Holm in San Lorenzo is up next here on the panel. Does anyone use blue blocker glasses for computing? And if so, do you get the ones with magnification? And are there various grades that look better on camera?
Go ahead, Roscoe.
I know Guy, I think, uses a pair, so I think I'd ask him this question. I don't use them myself.
I don't use them because I don't want to change the color, what I'm looking at, in that process. Now, my phone is permanently set to as warm as it will go. So if I decide I want to look at my phone in no color, I turn it off, but I leave it on because I did feel like I was I spent too much time on my phone, I admit, but I felt like something was burning a hole in my eye, like when I looked away. And so I turned it to all warm, and it definitely was more easier to look at for long periods of time. So I probably should just look at it less, but there you go. Next question. Go ahead, Marty.
On my Android phone and on my Windows desktop, there's a night mode or a blue blocker mode that just changes the color temperature to make it a little bit warmer, and you can actually schedule it for different times of day.
Next question.
Comes from Brett Ramsey in Melbourne, Australia. And he says the Final Cut Pro Summit started yesterday, sadly for those outside the USA. If you can't watch it live due to time zone or work constraints, then forget it. What's the point of staging an online event that only keeps American hours?
Go ahead, Alex.
Well, the name of it is the FCP Global Summit, and it isn't that global. It's kind of global, I would say. They had to call it global, I imagine, because it wasn't happening in person. So they came up with a different name for it. They do pick one session a day, it seems, to be available for streaming for 24 hours. I think they could pick a few more than that. That would be quite nice. That would be good. Essentially, I get the first half of each session a day, and then the sessions go on to 1, 2, 3 in the morning. So I'm not going to stay up for those. I think this is partially due to FMC having this upsell model to a VIP access so that you can actually watch all the videos. But even with VIP access, you can't ask too many questions. It would be cool if you could leave questions for certain sections, if you knew you had certain sections of questions for certain people. So it is hard to do a global event this way, especially if you have an upsell component. And I think they kind of FMC want to have a VIP general membership for people who also are part of the post-production events and also maybe other things such as their motion graphics shows or their remote production shows, and then generally encourage people to get to be upsold. So it's part of their model, even though I would guess that Apple are paying for most of this. But you'd think that Apple will allow a bit more longer playback because there's values to these videos outside the people who have attended the event.
I think that the fundamental problem with the VIP access model is that it assumes that the audience is getting content rather than generating content. The way we look at it, that's why we call everybody here producers, is that the content that we have here is generated by the audience. So the idea of making it exclusive would reduce the sample of who we have to actually ask the questions, which would reduce the overall quality of the experience. Go ahead, Bill.
I mentioned this to the panel here before, but I just wanted to say it publicly. Our own Chris Fenwick did one of the panels yesterday at the summit and did such an amazingly good job. It was an astonishing display of how to keep the energy and enthusiasm up amongst a group of 3 or 4 people who were in a panel setting, that I just wanted to give him a shout out because I thought he just did a marvelous piece of work there.
Yeah, I think that one of the things you have to really think about when you're doing a global event, because we've done a couple of them, is that you do have to figure out what goes into the evening and what goes into the early morning. You know, and then you have to, now you may still end up with your biggest events happening, at a, we find that like 8 o'clock is a relatively good, for most of the markets that we serve, 7 or 8 o'clock is a pretty good number. If pretty good time. It's good in Europe. It's late in Australia. But one of the things that you have to look at when you're building a global summit is you look at all the other summits and you look at what percentage of people are watching in different places, and then you aim at the middle of the mark. Like you just have, like you can't, you have to serve where most people come. And my guess is the post-production is probably 90% Europe and the United States. Now that may be a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're not serving it, but when they're building it, they still have to think about where most of the people are going to show up from. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, you also have to think about how you're going to fund some of these things. So I know some of what they were trying to do was to get money for replays. So these events are not free, and the traditional model had people in a room, which you could charge them for. So people are going to have to think about sponsorships and other ways to pay for these things.
It was paid for, I think, by Apple and OWC. They're not, so I think they're trying to how to make more money on it, I think is the question. But I don't think that I think it was underwritten to a point where I don't think that they had to. Those are seen as big sponsors, I think, on their site. So I think I think that was what made it. That was what paid for it. The gravy is trying to get the VIP and other ways of generating more margin. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. He says, when I went to a local festival, they had an auxiliary LED wall on a trailer that was being sent a signal from the main control trailer via Cat5 cable in a yellow jacket. What hardware could pass presumably SDI video over Cat5?
Go ahead, Courtney.
You can get SDI or HDMI sent over HD-base-T over Cat5 up to 4K for about 100 meters or so, so 300 feet or so. And it's pretty fast, low latency, and you just get a transmitter and receiver, and you're in business.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael is up next with, it has come out that the camera operator at the Astroworld Festival did call for help when an audience member pleaded for it. Would the TD at the other end of the comm system have had links to site management?
Go ahead, Rupert.
I'm not going to speculate on that case specifically, or those results will probably come out in time. But what I can say, in just general experience, is that when we have disasters or tragedies, that after the fact, investigations quite often found that whatever communication channels there were could have worked better or could have responded more quickly. And those are generally the results that come out of things like this. And, normally all that stuff would be built into an emergency response plan or training or communications plan. So we'll just have to see what comes out. But everybody should know what to do if they encounter an emergency, for sure. Go ahead, Alex.
I think partially it's the culture of, I know when we're working on events with a few hundred people, it's different from when it's 2,000 or 3,000 people. And if you're on comms, it's hard to take seriously anything that an audience member says to a member of crew. It's just because we don't see them as, and this is actually the bad aspect of it. Psychologically, they're the people that we're working towards, but they don't have get to have a say. So maybe this is how we psychologically position members of the audience, and whatever they say is taken seriously, even if it's extreme like this. I don't know.
Go ahead, Roscoe.
Generally, the stage manager is the person who has control over the event, whether it continues or not, especially in a live situation. The TD is not the person that, they may have access to the producers and such, but they're not the person who would make the call.
The real issue is velocity, decision velocity, and when something like this goes badly, there's not enough time to tell people what's going on before everything that was going wrong goes wrong. That's there's people have to, there's this, and this happens with all kinds of issues, and we make all kinds of mistakes all over the world, in a variety of different venues. Where it just takes too long to get the information to the people who can make the decision, because if someone is over officious, if you have a security guard that's over officious, they'll get fired. If they're telling people suddenly things that don't make any sense, and so they want to wait for someone to tell them to do something, and then you have to get the information to someone. A lot of times, what it really requires, and the real problem with this one was that they seemed to know what the police, the chief of police visited them going, hey, this is a problem, and so they knew it was coming. They just didn't know what to do about it. Next question.
Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, here on the panel says, I've tested 3 simultaneous camera feeds from a single Zoom room. It works, but it doesn't seem to provide simultaneous HD feeds from all 3. I'm wondering whether it divides up a fixed bandwidth budget. Anyone had a different experience?
I haven't quite figured out, I've seen a lot of varying resolution. I mean, I think that's the thing that I was actually watching a little bit of the Final Cut Global Summit yesterday, and noticed that even the screen captures were changing to 720, which in Final Cut made it unreadable. So it was kind of and it just would switch back and forth relatively often. And I have pretty fast bandwidth. I don't think it was me. And I don't know if I'm guessing it wasn't them either. So it does seem like we don't have a lot of stable control over the resolution in general. And I don't know if we have a certainty about that. Next question.
Comes from Rick Coombs in Columbia, Tennessee. And Rick asks, or notes, he's looking at 2 100-inch LED monitors for houses of worship to replace the 10,000 lumens projector. Any suggestions or things to be aware of in that area?
Go ahead, Marty.
I don't have any specific suggestions other to say that, it's very common. There's a difference between consumer models and commercial models. And commercial models are generally built to be on for longer hours than consumer models, but that's not such a concern in a church. But things to be aware of, I find, is that with flat panel projectors, reflections are much more of a problem with flat panels than with projection screens. If you have any kind of ambient light or light directed towards the screen, you're going to see reflections of those lights in the screen that'll just wash out your picture.
Good, Roscoe.
Exactly what he just said. Reflections are your biggest enemy. You got it, or just be able to mount them in such a way that you don't deal with any kind of your stage lights reflecting. And then secondarily, you want to get the orange power out there, because you really want to have a clean, if you have any kind of power transients and stuff running from the booth, that can give you some issues.
Go ahead, Brian.
So having worked in a house of worship, yeah, real professional, especially 100-inch monitors are going to be a gajillion dollars. So nearly no house of worship will buy those. And so you have to remember that consumer televisions, because that's what you're really looking at, when they're designing them, latency is not something that they really need to be concerned about, because they're showing television programs. They're not showing anything live. So in general, you're going to find that the video latency in a consumer television is much, much higher than you would expect, which means that anyone that's in the viewing audience that simultaneously has a view of the live stage and the iMag that's on the screens is going to get a very weird experience. Now, if you're only using this to project slides from ProPresenter or lyrics or video rolls or something like that, and you're not using it for iMag, then that's a non-problem. But as soon as you start using these for iMag, you have to really pay attention to how much processing latency is built into the monitor. And like I said, in most cases, consumer televisions, that's a place the engineers can trade off. They can, because in most cases, for what they're designing for, it just doesn't matter.
Game mode on your TVs is super important. The game mode lowers the latency. It gets rid of a lot of the processing, so you can't do a lot of things once you go into game mode, which is good, because usually all the things that the TV was doing were things you didn't want it to do. But game mode will reduce the latency that you're dealing with. Next question.
Second to the last one today. John Johnson of New York says, using ZoomISO for 4 to 5 Zoom participants to send them NDI to my switcher, and I've been getting intermittent flickering and sort of glitching to black on random individual NDI outputs. My network is good, and are there any ideas? And he's on a Mac Mini M1 with 16 gigs of RAM.
I think that 4 to 5 may be starting to get, well, I know we're doing 4, and it's not really pushing our M1 that hard. Although we're still, sussing out resolutions and so on and so forth. But NDI may also be treated slightly differently. We're using hardware outputs, but I don't have a solid answer for that, because no one else has their hand up. I don't think they do either. So we'll move on to the last question.
We're going to move on to the last question, which is a little bit specific here. Michael Drosty on the panel says, Alex, Lindsay, did the Bears ever stand a chance against the Steelers? Your opinion, please.
No, they did not. All right. So we're going to change subjects to the second hour a little early. We ran out of questions for the first hour, which is fine. I have a feeling this one this one will either go short or it'll go long, and I don't know which one yet. Now we're going to talk about gain staging. So does one of the panelists want to kind of explain? I guess you'll have to raise your hand here. We're working on a new tool for this, but explain what gain staging means, and explain a little bit about what it means and why it's important as we start to get ready to go. Go ahead, Brian, Jason.
I was about to say, yeah, it should be Brian, but I'll get it started. Gain staging is the way that you standardize your inputs to be a specific level coming into the mixer to reach this, unity gain. And I'll let Brian take it from there.
We're going to throw it at you, Brian, even though you didn't raise your hand.
All right. I have been officially called out. So I will say, Alex said, can you make sure you're here for gain staging? I said, sure, no problem. But in my back of my mind, I was like, but I hope Jeff Francis isn't there, because he's going to have all the right numbers and actually be far more precise in the way he explains this than I will be. And so hopefully he won't make me look too bad. But the whole bit with gain staging, or you'll hear it called gain structure, fairly other things, is that when we deal with audio signals, we're dealing with signals that are coming into our system at wildly different levels, and it's hard to overstate just how wildly different these things are, from very, very tiny microvolt levels all the way up to a full volt or even more of level. And, you know, they're tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of you know, gain points different. There isn't any processing equipment that can operate with all of those in their natural state. You know, you can't deal with things that are, you know, a microphone level that's way down here, trying to use all of my screen, and a line level that's all the way up here, and keep these things at the same level and try to process them. And then at the very end, oh, I'll like join them together and put them out at one given level. So the whole point of this is to try to get everything within some workable range that kind of works as a starting point, so that we can manipulate those signals then with some degree of accuracy. Back in the olden analog days, the big thing that you were always fighting was anything louder than a certain point and your equipment would start to distort because the voltage was just too high, and the various electronic bits inside just wouldn't be able to handle the extreme voltage. But if your signal was too low, the amount of noise that your equipment was generating, you know, your electronic paths were generating just as a function of being turned on, would overcome the level of the signal. And so you were always trying to get things within this window that was below distortion and above noise. As we've gotten digital, that window has gotten wider and wider, but you're still dealing with microphone signals coming in that are orders of magnitude below even that lowest digital level. And occasionally you're dealing with signals that are much too high even for that much larger digital window. So we're talking about getting things within that window, and then as we go through all of our various processing stages, keeping them within that window. So as we're, you know, cutting frequencies out with EQ, we may take a signal that's at this level and we may reduce it overall to this level, and then we may add some compression which may reduce it again to this level, and suddenly we're running out of room on the lower side of our dynamic range. And so we may need to add back some of that. By the same token, we boost some EQ, we make some makeup gain on a compressor, we put a crush group in another compressor, and now we're right at the very, very top of our dynamic range. So that's the very generalized idea of why we're dealing with gain staging and gain structure, and trying to always keep in mind where our signal levels of everything that we're working with in an audio chain are living at.
Jeff, how do you approach it when you have to set up the gain staging? How do you approach the process?
So we're primarily talking about analog gain staging here, and the problem with analog devices is they, as Brian was saying, they work across a bunch of different signals. I'll use some of my screen. I always talk about mic level signals, instrument level signals, line level signals, and speaker level signals, all analog things. And these are more than level, these are categories, because it's also whether they're balanced or unbalanced and how the impedances react, but we're primarily talking about level here. And then what the problem with analog is analog worked on the average signal level. So we think about pro line level being, you know, +4 dBu, but the problem is that audio gets loud and audio gets soft. So there are peaks that are above that, and different pieces of analog gear had different amounts of headroom. That point that Brian was talking about of where that analog gear distorted. So a battery operated Nagra device might only have 12 dB of headroom, but a audio console that plugs in and is a high quality, high dollar audio console might have 24 dB of headroom. So even though you set the analog line level to match those two, the Nagra will clip much sooner than the analog console would, because the analog console has more headroom. So it's about aligning not just that sort of average signal level point, but also aligning where the clip points are, so that we keep our signal between that point where things distort and the noise floor. And the weakest link, the device that has the smallest dynamic range, clip point down to noise floor is what we need to optimize for. And so oftentimes we'll use tone to do that. Tone can set a fixed level. Tone is also very easy to perceive distortion on. If you don't have measurement tools, cranking up a tone, you will hear a tone distort because it creates harmonic distortion. So you go from having a 1K tone to having additional higher frequencies added to it as soon as it begins to distort. So we'll set so that the distortion points are all at the same point. And that way we're not going to clip one device and give up our headroom or give up our dynamic range because we've clipped one device. When we get into digital, digital works with the 0 point at the top, at the point where things distort. And we set up an artificial headroom. Here in office hours, we set up an artificial amount of headroom by setting our target point at -24. And it's going to distort when we get up to 0. But all digital devices agree on 0 dBFS is the point at which we're maxed out.
Go ahead, Marty.
So everything that everybody said, but just to put it in a slightly different way. So there are, microphones that have a really small output signal, and then we have line level devices like synthesizers that have really high level signals. And once they get into the mixer, everything needs to be at the same level. If you look at the fader on any mixer, you'll see that the scale is logarithmic. That means that the difference between the physical distance between the 0 mark and the next increment, which could be plus or minus 5, and you take a look at that distance and now move it down and look at the difference at the bottom of the fader. You'll see there'll be a minus 30 mark, and the next one would be minus 50, and that's the same physical distance as 0 to 5. So there's a sweet spot. You have more range and control at the around the 0 mark than you do at the top of the fader or at the bottom of the fader. So when a signal gets into the mixer, everything needs to be at about the same level. When you get into the processes like noise gates and compressors and stuff, critical adjustments such as threshold, right, operate at a certain volume level of the signal. And if they're wildly different than anything else, you're not going to have any control over it.
So, and operationally, and you can tell me whether I'm, when I approach that, I'm trying to go I try to generate tone at one side of the chain and start working my way through the chain rather than changing all of them at the same time. And basically, what I'm doing is setting, and we'll talk about this a little later, setting my faders to unity or 0, just running 0 across all of those, and then changing all the gains, as I go through to get them all to that they are at a set, whether that's negative 16, 18, 20. Does anyone have a preference over which one of those there are? I see all of them. So I just need to know which one you need to know which one it is. But it's starting at one side, and then you slowly, as far as staging, go through that entire process. And I have to say that it is night and day. Like we had one, this is one of the few that Brian wasn't with us in, but we were at not the Win, but the Encore, I think. And we had one where it was the in-house audio was just all over the place. And I sent the audio engineer over and I said, I just need you to fix the gain stages. He went over it and it was like, they had never heard it sound so good. Like it was just, because there was all this hiss. That's one of the things you hear is you can distort on one side, but it can hiss on the other. So if you're bringing if somewhere in that pipeline, you've made that really quiet, and this happens a lot with transmitters, that you've made it really quiet, and then you're bringing it back up. You just grabbed onto that whole noise floor and just shoved it into the center of your show. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, an important thing in gain staging is to go serially through your chain. At each stage of amplification, you have that limitation that Brian was talking about, and so you want to make sure that you're landing close to the top, but not the ability to go over the top. So if, for example, and then that stage then goes into the next stage, which goes in the next stage of amplification. So there's amplification all the way along the way. And if you exceed that top anywhere down the line, you're not going to be able to get rid of that distortion further down the line by reducing the level anywhere else. So you got to make sure your first input, like your microphone preamp input, that you're not exceeding the maximum level of that microphone preamp, so you're going into distortion, because if it's distorting there, you can turn everything else down all along the way and you're not going to get it to stop distorting. You'll be lower level, but it'll still be distorted. So that's why gain staging is important. And it's important to get it up to the higher level, because the higher level you get without going into distortion, then you can work at lower levels as you get further up along the way, and so you don't have a cumulative noise level from the inherent noise of each preamplifier along the way.
Go, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit of a discussion about the why here. The 100mm fader that everybody uses is not intended to make things louder. It's intended to show the contribution to the mix. The way that you need to do that is to make sure that the loudest guitar, noise hissing thing on your board and the quietest thing have the same amount of throw or contribution. When I go up 10%, I want 10% more contribution to the mix. The only way to do that is to standardize the inputs to a unity.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, also, I think it's worth noting that in the analog days, you could go over the nominal level and you would do a thing called soft clipping. In fact, people even like that, putting a microphone right up to the top and getting that little extra energy out of it. In the digital realm, once you hit 0, and if it goes over that, the whole signal can completely fall apart to the point where you can't understand anything. So it's critical to keep below that max level in digital systems.
And once your ear is tuned, I mean, even if you're hitting the limiter, you can hear it. You can hear it squash against that limiter. That so it's not just that it'll distort. It's just that some people like that sound. I don't. Anyway, let's jump into the questions. Go ahead. First question.
Absolutely. It comes from Tim Holm, and Tim's question is, when you say tone out a system, can you walk through a step-by-step procedure and explain how it works with various components? For example, keyboards, mics, playouts, and so forth.
Good, Marty.
So we're talking about adjusting the system for gain staging and for equalization when we're talking about a system with loudspeakers in a room. You can certainly do gain staging and should if you're not using loudspeakers, like if you're in a recording mode and you have a recording chain. You're not necessarily, so we can do tone out a system. You can call it that. You can call it gain staging. And the way we used to do it in broadcast, we would take a tone generator, because that is a very determined volume level or signal level, and then put it in one side and then go through every stage in the audio chain and make sure that the output equals the input all the way through to the recorder. In a situation, a live situation with loudspeakers, we're looking at other aspects of the system. We're looking for balanced frequency responses into the room that we're dealing with. We're also looking at room resonances that could cause feedback, with open microphones that we want to avoid. A lot of different things with a live setting that we don't deal with in a recording chain.
Go ahead, Brian.
So I don't typically use the term tone out a system, although I understand what's meant by the question. One of the things that I was thinking of as others were talking about this tone and taking a tone and generating a tone to go through your whole system, which is a completely valid approach. Except, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially analog components, actually specifically analog components, are not perfectly flat or the same at all frequencies. So you can run a 1K tone through an analog circuit front to back, make it match perfectly. If you run a 100 hertz tone through, you may not get the exact same result. If you run a 10K signal through, you may not get the exact same. We're not talking about huge differences if it's high quality components, but those are the kinds of places where lower quality components start to really rear their ugly head, is that they'll be very nonlinear. And 1K tone will go right through the whole thing and sound just great. And then you'll try to run 100 hertz through it, and all of a sudden you'll notice that it drops off by 6 dB by the time it gets to the end of the chain. Or 10K will be, it just will not, the frequency response will not be as flat as you'd like. But to get back to the basic question, it's all about starting from the beginning and going to the end. I know that sounds like a really, really oversimplistic explanation, but specifically with regards to sound reinforcement systems, one of the most common mistakes that I see made is people turn the amplifiers on and they take their master volume control on their mixer and they turn it up to 0, and then they proceed to try to set their gain structure to where it's the right amount of loudness. And they've started at the wrong end. They've basically set a volume level at the end, and now they're trying to move everything to match where that gain is at the very end of the system. And that's precisely the wrong order of operations. What you want to do is essentially turn those speakers off, turn that master level all the way down. That's the very last part of the chain. What you want to do is plug your microphone in, or your keyboard, or a tone generator, or whatever your signal source is. Find within your particular piece of equipment the first place where you can monitor that signal. Most mixers have some sort of PFL control, some sort of Q control that you can literally see a meter and be able to move the head amp or mic preamp level and adjust it to where it's, and usually the meters give you a very friendly, like green, and then some yellow, and then red. Red is bad. Red means stop, don't go to red. A little bit of yellow is usually pretty good. Right around green is pretty good. If you've got, 20 LEDs and 10 of them are green and you're only lighting 2 of them, you don't have enough. Give it a little boost. It's really, as simple as that. And then trying to go to in whatever your signal chain is, after the next stage of things, and find a metering point or a monitoring point at the next level and do the same sort of thing. And, throughout the chain, theoretically, if you do this correctly, sound reinforcement system, you'll be able to put all of your faders at or right around unity. We talk about unity all the time and don't necessarily explain what that is, but faders have increments, and there is a 0 that's about, I'm looking at mine now, about 3/4 of the way up on most mixers. There is a 0. 0 means I'm not taking anything away, I'm not adding anything to. It's unity. What's coming in is what's going out. Theoretically, if we've set our gain structure correctly, we can take our faders, put them at unity. We can take our fader to our master, put it at unity. And what we see on that input metering when we hit the PFL should match what we see on our output metering after the master. They should be very close, if not exactly the same to each other. Then we turn on our power amplifiers. We blow everybody out of the room because there's way too much level. And then we go to the amplifier, which has its own gain stage, and we turn the volume down on the amplifier so that we've maintained the best possible gain structure all the way until we get up to the amplifier. And then if we need to reduce the level so that the speakers are not killing everyone, we can reduce it right there at the amplifier, and we've maintained the best signal to noise from beginning to end.
Good, Jeff.
Thank you, Brian. That was awesome. And thank you for getting that about the amplification, because many PA systems have way too much gain because they have that. And if you start backwards, you end up with everything really low, and you're sitting in your noise floor and you're just amplifying all the noise that's in the system, doing what Brian said, getting the gain stage correct. So if you think about a typical, if you got a band on stage and then you have some talking speakers, depending on the source, if you put a microphone that is very sensitive, say a condenser microphone, it gives you more electrical output for the same amount of acoustic input. That needs less gain on the mic preamp than would a dynamic microphone. If that microphone is on a quiet sound source, it's going to need more gain. A loudspeaker is going to need less preamp gain than a soft-spoken person. So those are all the decisions we make, and we try to do that as early in this stage as possible. And that's usually the mic preamp, right where the signal enters our mixer and gets optimized for line level in the mixer. TJ's got a question coming up, and it's talking about what is unity gain? Why do we say unity, which is 1, when the fader is marked 0? Well, unity is multiplying by 1. Don't change it. So faders do louder and softer. They get things bigger, they get things smaller. Multiplying by 1 is don't change it. Multiply by 2 makes it louder. Multiply by a half makes it quieter. I don't like multiplication, so decibels use logarithms to take multiplication ratios and turn them into nice simple numbers. 0 dB is no change, don't change. Positive decibels is louder, and negative decibels are quieter.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, Brian covered almost everything really perfectly. The only thing I would say is that to tone out, I usually consider that as really a calibration step. And it's to calibrate without, you can tone out without using your ears, although I don't advise it, where you have a known signal level going into the first stage, amplifier stage, and it's aligning the meters along the way. And you might have meters on your preamps, you might have meters on your output, you might have meters on your compressor, and it's to align the meters so that they all agree that this, let's say 560 millivolt input is the same level, whatever you set as your 0 point, which is minus 12 or minus 18 or minus 20, is the same from meter to meter to meter. That way you can know by looking at the meters if things are exceeding the parameters of each preamp along the way. And then, of course, you get into the gain staging effects, all of that stuff, and the calibration of the meters.
And theoretically, I mean, one of the big things is that if you want to make sure that your engineer who's making those decisions knows that the levels at the far end are roughly the same as the levels that they're sending down, that those aren't wildly different. There's a known truth, across the entire system. Next question.
Next question comes from Douglas Carmichael. Douglas says, when you are setting gain when connecting a synth or drum machine, groove box, something like that, to an audio interface, what's the best practice? Use a fixed tone and set levels, or run normal program and adjust to the yellow range?
Go ahead, Brian.
Jeff is going to disagree with me. I'm betting, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong. I'm an eyeball kind of guy. I cannot tell a lie. It's like, if I'm connecting a synthesizer or something like that, I tend to play the thing, look at the meters, make sure the meters are in the yellowish range, make sure I'm not seeing a bunch of red stuff. And I'm probably in the general ballpark. Now, one of the things you have to watch out for is, and this does go back to what several people have said, synthesizers are known to not have a fixed level. You go to another patch and all of a sudden they're screaming loud. You go to another patch and all of a sudden they're really quiet. So you may find, you set it to a nice, noisy sawtooth kind of old school Moog kind of sound, and you play into it and you set your level to that. And then you move it to like a piano sound, and all of a sudden you lose 15 dB of level. And you're like, I thought I set this correctly. It's because your source changed. And it's really no more complicated than, I put a microphone in front of a guitar amp and I set my level for that. And then the guitar amp went away and somebody walked up with a harp and started to play a harp in front of the same microphone. It's like, well, yes, now you have to change your gain because your source material has changed. But yeah, I tend to kind of keep it simple. And it's like, if this is the thing that's going into it, set the level so that you're in a good range. I think in later questions we're going to get more into peak levels versus average levels and how sometimes those input meters can fool you. But that's kind of my general answer.
And also, this is not really directly related, but this is why we rehearse. Like people a lot of times think that the talent is the only one that needs to rehearse, but this entire pipeline that we're talking about is why you need to do rehearsals as close to the real thing as possible, so that the entire tech crew can understand that where the cameras need to be and what the levels are. And, oh, I didn't realize you were going to do that with the mic. And, oh, I didn't, and that rehearsal, the more you rehearse, the closer you get to something usable. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, Brian, I'm agreeing with you. I do the same thing. It's about there. So I'm usually looking at digital meters. I'm recording more than I'm live sound, so I'm looking at digital meters in a workstation, looking at Pro Tools meters. So I'm looking for average levels in the -16 to -20. I don't want to peak above -6. Why? Because even in a rehearsal, nobody's going to do exactly what they actually do. That drummer is going to hit things much louder when they're actually playing in the gig than they do during the sound check. So leave yourself some room with the quality of electronics and digital across the board. Cheap stuff, expensive stuff, the quality has gotten great. So you're not going to fix that distortion very easily. So leave yourself plenty of headroom. So when I'm setting gains, I'm not going to get too close to peak.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I'd say the more dynamic the instrument's total range is, the more headroom it needs. You always start cautiously. Generally the way that I get synthesizer is a great example. In the ballpark is I start with pink noise, and I'll actually roll a Perkins EQ, and I'll just sweep it all the way through to kind of get a sense of it. After that, middle C, sustain, and I hit every patch.
Go ahead.
That's usually a good place to start.
Good, Bill.
And the thing about tone is usually not variable, and the human voice is very variable. As an announcer type, it's one of the craziest things. But if I have to walk on a stage where somebody's been singing and use that mic for some kind of an announcement, it always drives me a little bit crazy, because human voice can go from a really quiet whisper to incredibly powerful for a singer opera trained hitting a big note. And that range is so gigantic that really somebody needs to be watching those levels, and a tone doesn't give you anything close to that range of different energy that you need to pay attention to.
I will say it's one of the reasons we try to give hosts their own mic, like that we've synced, like this is the host mic. This is not the performer's mic. We don't have them go up and use the same mic just because we don't want to have to, I don't want to have to change it for the host and then change it back. And then that's now adding another variable that I don't want to do during a live show. Go ahead, Marty.
Brian hit on a really interesting point about in synthesizers in particular, and I will argue also instrumentalists and even some vocalists now who use a series of stomp boxes, effects boxes. They have their own gain staging thing that they need to do because they have multiple devices or multiple processing stages. Like in a synthesizer, you'll have many different sounds, and you may have a string of processes between filters and generators and oscillators and stuff, and you'll be changing them like multiple times within a single song, and all of those need to be gain staged so that when you switch patches, your level does not change in a way that you don't intend it to for that particular song. And guitarists who use stomp boxes are the same thing. Every device, every box needs to be gain staged so that when you change sounds, that your level doesn't change. Now, where to set those to? I would think that there'll be a difference between whether you're doing a recording chain or if you're in a live performance situation. Because when you're recording, you want to record maximum level all the time, and then you can mix it in post. When you're performing, you'll have parts of the song where you may be taking the lead and you'll be louder, and other parts where you're part of the rhythm section and you'll be lower, and you need to, and that's usually up to the performer, the musician, to make those level changes, and then the sound engineer is just checking that and refining that, because they're not really arranging the song. Performer is arranging the song, so you need to account for that when you're setting up your gain stage.
Good, Bill, real quick.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly. Also, that range is getting bigger. I'm thinking of Billie Eilish right now, who has a very intimate kind of whispery delivery. That's a lot less energy coming in than a traditional singer on stage. So this is getting more difficult, I think, as these new forms rather than less difficult.
We've worked with a handful of artists that you can barely hear when they're singing. Like they're so quiet on air. Like they could never hold a room because they have a voice that only works when it's magnified. It's a really interesting process. Next question.
TJ Asher in Minneapolis is up next. He says, please explain unity or unity gain as if I were a second grader.
Yet another pass at it. Go ahead, Jeff.
So unity is the same, no change, multiply by 1. And faders change gain, preamp, microphone preamp gain knobs change gain, and they're going to make things louder. That's positive decibels. That's a ratio of greater than 1. So multiply by 2, multiply by 3, multiply by 10. And then things that get quieter, negative decibels, is multiplying by a fraction, getting half as big, quarter as big.
Good. Marty?
Unity gain simply means output equals input with no change. And that's in all aspects, frequency response and level.
Good. Brian?
Sorry, everything that everybody's saying is perfectly correct. One of the things I want to dispel is a myth in this, and that is gain is gain is gain is gain. Frequently, I see people, they have feedback in their speaker system. And so they say, yeah, but if I turn down my mic pre and turn up my fader, the feedback goes away. And all that you did was you took 3 dB off the gain. I guarantee you didn't create some kind of magic by turning down in one place and turning up. Gain is gain is gain. It's all the same. If you add 10 dB at the front end and you take 10 dB off the end, you still have the same amount of gain. When you start moving to the edges of the capability of the equipment, so you start to get into distortion or you start to get into noise floor, some things can become nonlinear. But just very frequently, I just see people who think, well, if when I moved it down here and up here, then the feedback went away, or when I moved it up here and down here, then it sounded better. Particularly in the digital domain, it literally is math. It's literally math. So if you add 2 at the beginning of the equation and you go to the end of the equation and then you subtract 2, you're still going to end up with the same result. And it really is as simple as that. It's simple math. In the analog realm, when you start talking about the very last stage, typically in a digital chain where you go into analog at the very first stage, things can get a little nonlinear, but nevertheless, basically gain is gain is gain.
Go ahead, Jeff.
So 2 things. What Brian was just saying is really important about the non-linear. If you are doing something wrong and your initial mic preamp gain is way too high, and so you've pulled your fader down, you now have a distorted audio that's quiet. And so turning the mic preamp down to its proper gain and bringing the fader up so that the level is the same, now you could have clean audio. So that's a place where that adjustment, as Brian said, takes you out of the non-linear and gets you into the proper thing. What Marty said very early on about the 100 millimeter fader, and now that we have that in all of our digital domains, it's in the ATEM software that we have faders. That unity gain point is the point where we're 0 on the fader. It's about 3/4 of the way up, but that's where you have the most fine control. And as you move away from that point, a very small movement makes a big change. So you want to try to stay in that region with your faders, just to give you the finest adjustment control, that you actually have that. So the only time that I might change how I set up a gain structure of something is like pre-show music. I might take the pre-show music and actually turn down the preamp gain on the pre-show music because I don't want it that loud. And so I don't want to run the fader of the pre-show music down at -40 because a very small move will make that music get very loud. So I might turn down the gain of my pre-show music source. But otherwise, so that I can leave the fader at 0 and be close to and have fine control.
Yeah,
oh, I just smash it with a compressor.
All right. Next question.
Comes from Roscoe Jones here in the panel. Herb Zeddy's TV training CD, yes, it's that old, has some great animations showing audio signal flow and gain staging. Are there any good animations showing this now that we're in the digital era?
We should try to collect some. I'm sure that there's some good ones floating around on YouTube about some of those things. And so, I mean, usually there's somebody's animated it at some point. So we should look at it. And if there isn't, if we're missing those, we should think about how we animate those on the new site. I'd like to start. These are the kind of things that would be really fun to build little 1-minute videos of understanding gauge staging or understand. And the hardest thing to do is how do you condense it down to 60 to 120 seconds of I can watch this and immediately walk away with understanding what that is. And so I think that that's a challenge for a lot of us. Next question.
TJ Asher is back from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He says, Alex just said, if your ear is trained, you can hear that. Can we get either some second hours or labs to help us train our ears to hear certain things like hitting the limiter or various good and bad audio issues?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we're moving to Office Hours 2.0 is to get ready to be able to do that. So the problem really is that there's all kinds of irregularities in the way Zoom manages high quality audio and stereo and everything else. By moving this to YouTube, we can have people actually listen to something that we can actually put a lot more data into, potentially, and so potentially even binaural if we want to kind of talk about moving things around. So understanding basic pieces as well as understanding possibly some spatial inputs are things that we want to do in the future, and we're not going to. I don't think we can do it in Zoom anytime soon. And so getting to another platform, and YouTube is one of them, we may need to move to even other platforms for doing even higher end if we want to talk about Atmos and Vision or something like that, or 514, 714, 916, any of those things. We would want to do something different. So the plan is to get to a point where we can stream, by moving to 2.0, we can stream extremely high quality audio and video out, and then that's going to allow us to both train our ears and our eyes as we go down the path. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. I remember going to a Cheap Trick concert where the engineer preferred his Midas XL200 versus the House Yamaha PM5D because he could hit the preamps harder. Isn't the general guideline too much red is bad, especially with digital?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Too much red is bad, except when it's good. So there are times when we want to, for the sonic effect of the clipping distortion of a particular device, and we're talking about analog mic preamps, we may run them into the nonlinear region because we like the way that sounds. Distortion is very close to compression because we are squashing peaks. So for drums, oftentimes running a mic preamp really up at the top of its gain and into the red makes the drums sound better.
Go ahead, Brian.
So I have a show that I do that 4 people watch, where a bunch of us audio engineers all gather around and argue our opinions about things. And this is a topic that we argue about constantly as to whether distortion is good or bad. So to recap the question a little bit, because there's a lot more to unpack in here than just mic pre's. We are talking about the difference between an all analog console, which was the XL200, versus a PM5D, which is a digital console other than just the mic pre. But Midas is been renowned since the beginning of time for having mic pre's that clip nicely, that when pushed into distortion have a soft, pleasing harmonic to them that an awful lot of people have gotten used to and an awful lot of people really like. And if you're a mix engineer and you are used to using that as part of your sound, So you've become accustomed to, I'm introducing this coloration intentionally to the overall sound of my mix in order to achieve a specific effect. And all of a sudden, someone takes away that ability. All of a sudden your mixes kind of fall apart because you've used this tonality as part of what you're doing. You're intentionally using this non-linearity that these mic pre's give you. The Yamaha PM5D, Yamaha consoles in general, are engineered to be as linear as possible all the way up until they turn to absolute distorted garbage. It's just a different engineering approach. It's neither one of these are right or wrong. It's just a different way to approach the same problem. And if you're accustomed to that sort of a linearity, which is what my career has been based on, I have always used Yamaha consoles. The idea of pushing a mic pre into a tiny bit of saturation in order to introduce a sound to the mix, it doesn't appeal to me at all. But neither one of these approaches is wrong. It literally comes down to a bit of an artistic approach. Again, though, the end of your question, just to circle back to that, in digital, if you truly go into the red in digital, which essentially means you've gone past the 0 point, you've literally run out of numbers, you will always get horrible, if icky clipping. Like this is a definite thing that's always a thing. Some digital equipment will set its red line 5 dB below that, just to give you a little bit of, in case you do something dumb, we're going to give you a little bit of, and I say 5 dB, some small number below that. They'll give you a red a little bit early, just to kind of warn you that you're getting a little bit close. Analog is just a much less obvious progression from it sounds great to it sounds horrible. There's just a wider gap in there because you're talking about analog components that just, softly start to not like what you're doing until you overdo it. Think of it like applying too much voltage to a light bulb. The light bulb, an old school light bulb, incandescent light bulb, it will get brighter and it will get brighter. And then it will get, once you get past its design voltage, it will continue to get brighter and brighter until it says, I don't want to do this anymore, and then it goes away. Right. It's a certain amount of linearity. So it's, these are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about the difference between an analog gain and a digital gain.
Go ahead, Marty.
It's hard to follow up Professor Maddox here, and I'd love to get in on your audio class. Microphone preamps, are the most critical component in an audio chain where there's a microphone. And there are so many different ones, and they all sound different. I mean, recording engineers will have highly personalized opinions and preferences, and they will spend thousands of dollars on a single channel of mic preamp. And when you're dealing with, a console, there are strictly analog preamps, like early Personas, and some other boards will have analog preamps, and there's no control over them other than the dial at the top. There's no digital. Then there are microphone preamps that have digital control so that they can be stored. And then there are digital preamps. And with analog preamps, there is headroom. You can go over 0. And as Brian was saying, they will saturate. And saturation can be a very pleasing thing for the right kind of event or right kind of audio. And in different preamps, more expensive preamps will have wider dynamic range where you have a lot of leeway to play with, and less expensive preamps will have a very small defined dynamic range. You have to stay within that, otherwise you'll just fall apart.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Everyone has said some really great stuff here. Another way to think of it, the difference between analog and digital distortion is that usually in a digital mixer, you'll have, it depends on where the A to D stage is. You'll have an analog preamp that maybe is amplifying the voltage, and then at some point there's a device computer-like device that converts that analog voltage to a number. And then from there on out, the rest of the processing is done with math. It's all done with math. Impedance doesn't matter, voltages really don't matter. It's the math on those bits. And the A to D converters, the early A to D converters, didn't have brick wall limiters on them. And it depends on the amount of bit depth. The amount of bit depth determines the amount of dynamic range you have to play in on the output of your A to D converter. And the problem is in the early A to D converters, when you went above the maximum, because it's stored as 2's complement, it's a method of changing those voltages into bits. If in an analog, if you went up to the top, it just flattened off the top of the sine wave. Like if you sent a sine wave in with too much gain and it exceeded the gain of your preamp, it just have a flat top on it, and then it would come back down and then go negative again. And the sine waves go above, so many volts above, or so many millivolts above, and then so many millivolts below zero. So it's positive and negative voltage. And what would happen in the A to D conversion is if they didn't trap when it exceeded the maximum number of bits you had to count where you were, it would go from 100% positive to the next sample would be 100% negative. And that's what creates that horrible digital distortion, that where
so it's jumping between the two.
It's jumping from one sample to 100% positive to 100% negative. And there are A to D converters now that will just trap that overflow. So when it gets to 100% positive, it'll just stay at 100% positive until the sample drops back below that, and then it'll continue to track correctly. So that it doesn't do that 100% negative until it drops below, and then it jumps back up to 100% positive again. So they have a way of treating it. So it makes it.
I didn't know that. That's a very good key little bit of knowledge there of why the static sounds like. I just know that there's static there and that we should stay away from it. You know, there's a lot of shipwrecks over there that I try to stay away from.
This is how floating point can actually take that into consideration and get rid of it for you.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, the problem that Courtney's talking about was an early digital problem, along with some other things with bad anti-alias filters, but those have been all pretty well solved by oversampling. So you're hearing just the flat line distortion of digital clipping. You're not hearing that complete flip of the 2's complement.
But it was really common. Like 10 years ago, that was like digital, thing you were always afraid of.
About turn of the millennia, we kind of solved all those in most markets.
Yeah. I felt like it was 10 years ago, but maybe it was just so bad 20 years ago that I kept worrying about. Maybe I had equipment that was old enough that it was just problematic. Next question.
Mike Beardmore of Reading in the UK says, on my PC, I find YouTube within Mukana for office hours is lower volume than radio stations directly streamed in the same browser. What could be the reason and solution?
Go ahead, Brian.
So a radio station is compressed. Also, it's compressed. They use very expensive compressors, multiple gain stages of compression. And typically the program material is one person, or it's simplified. There's two hosts, maybe there's one call in. One of the things that makes our show here a little bit more challenging is we have, right now we have 12, 15 people on the panel, all of whom are calling in with completely different systems, using completely different signal chains. And so as a result, we have to leave more headroom to accommodate the fact that some people are going to come in louder, some people are going to come in softer. It's sort of an inherent limitation of doing really a truly live show. Now, I strongly suspect that replays of this show that have gone through an editing process are probably much, much louder sounding, because someone's been able to then go through after the fact and heavily compress those peaks and valleys of our various setups and make it sound more radio-like. But I mean, that's you just distilled probably the biggest challenge between doing a live streaming or a live broadcast event versus doing something that is in a fixed environment like a studio or a radio studio, which may still be live, may still be people, but it's you know who's talking, you know that your radio presenters are going to stay 1 inch off the microphone and not move. They're trained to not change their voice levels by much. I mean, everything is in a controlled environment, and you're able to get much closer to the ceiling of available gain than you can in an environment like what we're working with here.
Go ahead, Bill.
There's also a regulatory reason that this sound, I think, became so popular in radio, particularly AM radio in the early days, and that is that the transmitters had limits that the FCC allowed them on radiated power. And so there was a cap, and unless you were across the border in Mexico or something like that, which those old stations like the X stations that Wolfman Jack were on, who could bribe their way into more power, there was this cap. Well, when you're dialing in AM radios, you want your station to pop out. So there was this constant push to maximize the signal, make it as loud as humanly possible, yet not exceed that transmitter power and get a huge fine from the FCC. So the sound of radio, particularly AM radio, became in your face constantly. And I think we still kind of associate that with hot, cool pop music.
And we purposely look at a lower LUFS, than we probably, because we want to make sure that we include everyone that's joining the panel. So we want to have, we're coming in, we aim a little lower just to make sure that no one's distorting on the way up, because most of us can hit -24, but some would have hard time hitting -20 or -18. And so as a result, we aim a little lower. Now, what we could do is, of course, in post, especially as we move to 2.0, is we could bump that up and then also compress it on the way out. And so, and that may be coming. So we may get closer to a radio sound as we kind of work through it. It's on the list of things to do, is to kind of pay attention to the audio. We just haven't done in 2.0. We haven't done a lot of work on it because right now we're stuck with whatever we send into Zoom. As we go to 2.0, we can do a lot of post processing. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael says, when gain staging software plugins, do the same principles apply as analog devices?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Generally, no. If you're dealing with normal linear software plugins, you can be pretty lax. So digital audio is commonly captured as fixed point, as 16 or 24-bit. And then in the processing of most DAW digital audio workstations, we deal with something called floating point. So floating point adds an additional 8-bit exponent. So it's kind of like scientific notation. So we have, 2.6 times 10 to the 12th power. Well, we take our 24-bit signal and we can shift it over a huge range. So 24 bits is 144 dB of dynamic range. 32-bit floating point is 1500 dB of dynamic range. So you can be completely wrong with all of your gain staging, and you can crank up the gain or you can drop the gain in your channel of your workstation, and you won't mess things up. You'll never actually distort. You'll never actually fall into the noise floor. Of course, when you come out the other end, you need to be correct because it's going to come back out as a 24-bit signal. But you can try this in your workstation. Try dropping in a plugin that adds, 96 dB of gain, and it will look like in the waveform that you've completely squashed it. But then if you follow it with a 96 dB attenuation, it will sound completely fine. Some caveats to that. If the plugin is a nonlinear, so it's a distortion plugin, it's an emulation of some kind of saturation, it's a compressor that does something different based on level, then absolutely gain stage really, really matters there. Also be really careful. I had one multiband compressor limiter plugin that the limiter was always in even when you hit bypass. And so I was thinking this should, in floating point notation, as soon as I hit bypass, this should never cause any clipping, but it was causing it to be fixed to that limiting. And the plugin coder had done that as a safety measure. Unfortunately, it wasn't listed in the manual. It wasn't until I hunted them down and got that answer. I won't tell you who that is.
Go ahead.
So always be careful.
Yeah, Brian.
I was when Jeff started with no, I was going to disagree with him until he then put all the caveats on, and now I agree with him. The only thing that I would add is having a plugin add 25 dB of gain will absolutely affect the next plugin you have in the stage. It's the signal going into that next plugin is going to be 25 dB louder. And so if it's a compressor, that's going to affect your threshold. It's going to affect, it won't go into clipping. You don't have to worry about noise floor. You can be very lax about those kinds of things, but if you're going into a saturation plugin, or you're going into something that's adding harmonics, or you're going into a compression plugin out of, say, an equalization plugin, and you've added a whole bunch of gain with a whole bunch of EQ, it will push you into compression earlier. And so the two will affect each other.
Whoops, you're muted, Alex.
Sorry, next question.
Josh Kaufman, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, says, with an event with a PA system and microphones for participants, what are the techniques for tuning the speakers for the lowest potential feedback? What additional equipment helps to keep the speakers out of the mics?
Go ahead, Marty.
Additional equipment? I'm not sure that there is much additional equipment that can be used to keep sound from the loudspeakers out of the mics, but it is important to understand what microphones you're using and how they're picking up sound, and the loudspeakers that you're using and how they're dispersing sound. The voice band, the frequency band that we hear voice, is kind of split between the high frequency drivers in a loudspeaker and the low frequency drivers, the tweeters or the horn and the woofers. Sound that comes out of a compression horn is going to be a lot more directive in where how it's dispersing sound than the low frequency drivers, which can be more omnidirectional. So where you put the speakers, the way, the angle that the speakers are pointed in, both in the horizontal and vertical axis, keeping the speakers out in front of the microphones, and trying using more directional microphones than omnidirectional microphones, all can benefit from minimizing feedback. And we also cannot discount the acoustics of the space that we're working in, both the room that the sound from the speakers is going into and the acoustics of the area where the microphones are, which could be behind the speakers. But the general process is to open up your microphones one at a time, bring up the gain till it starts to feedback, identify that specific frequency, and put a real sharp notch filter in there to cancel that frequency out. Not too deep, because we only want to cancel out the enough gain to cancel the feedback, but not to affect the sound of the microphone, or do that as minimal as possible.
Go ahead, Brian.
So everything Marty said was correct. Not that that's a surprise. Rule the number one thing to prevent feedback in a sound reinforcement system is where you put the microphones and where you put the speakers. The speakers farther away from microphones, always good for feedback control. Speakers downstage, we say in the theater, in front of where the microphone is, always a good thing. Using microphones that are directional so that the pattern that they're picking up is accentuated in one direction, that is towards where the sound is coming from, i.e. the person singing, and not where the speakers are, that helps tremendously. But you have to remember that everything in the room that has to do with sound is nonlinear. All of it. The loudspeakers are not linear. The microphones are not linear. The resonance in the room is not linear. That means that there are certain frequencies that are emphasized either by the room or the sound of the speakers or the pattern control of the microphone. And so when you raise your gain to a certain level, yes, you'll start to hear a ringing at that particular frequency, because some combination of those things has accentuated that frequency, and then dipping that frequency a little bit can help minimize some of that nonlinearity. You can push a little bit further, maybe you find another frequency, you do the same sort of thing. Maybe you push it a little bit further and you find a third frequency and you do the same sort of thing. In general, in my 30 years of experience, much past that third frequency, now you're officially just chasing your tail. Now you're just putting more nonlinearity into the system rather than actually fixing some of the nonlinearities that are there. But yeah, I always just go back to put the speakers in the right place, put the microphones in the right place, concentrate on the signal going into your microphone being as close as possible to the microphone. So don't let your singers, sing like this. Let them get right up on it. If someone's speaking with a handheld microphone, tell them don't hold it at your waist. That's 90% of the way there. And then there are little tweaks you can do. That last little point, everyone looks for a magic bullet, a magic box that if I just put this box in line, it will make the feedback go away. That box does not exist. I'm sorry, but that box does not exist. There are boxes that can potentially, maybe in certain situations, increase your success rate a little bit. But there is no magic box that just, you put this in and you turn it on and your problems go away.
From mic placement, I noticed that when someone picks up an SM58 and just about touches their chin and then pulls away by about an inch or two, I know they're trained. like I know that you've been told how to do this, because you'll see them. It's a funny thing that they'll do is they'll go up and they'll touch their chin and then they'll pull down, and someone's trained them to do that, and it really, like on an SM58, makes all the now you know that you're in a safe. I'm now in a safe space. This is all going to work. Yeah, go ahead, Bill, real quick.
Real quick, feedbacks are loops. And so there's a couple of, you've seen people, they move the mic away and it doesn't change anything about the feedback because it's not really that it's reflecting off your face or something like that. Mm-hmm. It is its own loop. The thing to me is that this is why you must rehearse. You must check it out. And you also have to understand that even if you rehearse and if you're too close to the point, the addition of the crowd or sets or props or anything changing in the room can change that dynamic a little bit, and you can still run into feedback, and you've got to quash it because it's horrible for the people listening.
Next question.
Moving on, James Hutchison in Dublin, Ireland is next. And James says, are Brian and Jeff sharing the same set of AirPods?
It did look like it. When Jeff was here, he had one ear and you and Brian had the other. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, the last time I looked, Jeff was, well, you know what? It's because I'm in the mirror mode. So yeah, it does. Yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Yes, we are. Jeff shipped me one side.
That's how they say that we secret AirPod friends.
Exactly. Right. We're secret AirPod friends. That's 100% correct.
Next question.
I love that. I got to get that website, Secret AirPod Friends. Douglas Carmichael, would a Class A direct box like the Phoenix Audio N8, and then there's a link, be beneficial when bringing synths into an audio interface?
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. That is an extremely dense version of a DI box, but you're still going to have to gain stage it.
I'm still thinking of a band named Secret AirPod Friends. All right, next question.
Next one, Douglas Carmichael is up again, and this time he says, when using a saturation filter box like the Electron Analog Heat, a link there, what gain structure issues should I be aware of?
Go ahead, Brian.
I don't know that specific box, but I'm just going out on a limb here and guessing the type of box it is. And most likely, if it's a saturation or a filter box, it probably generates some really sharp harmonic peaks that you have to keep an eye out for, depending on probably the settings of the box and everything else. And so you may end up with a signal that's average level is right here-ish, but there are 3 or 4 little weird frequency peaks that are like 20 dB hotter or something. And so again, you kind of have to twiddle the knobs till it sounds good is my official mantra. And in that particular case, again, I'm not familiar with the specific box, but you may find that you get your gain structure set in a place where you really like it. And then you start tweaking with your filter box to get a sound you really like. And all of a sudden your gain structure goes out the window because you've dramatically changed the source. It's no different, like I said, than going from a guitar amp to a harp. You've changed the source going in, and you may have to circle back and readjust and it will probably come out in something very obvious. You'll just be like, oh, I twiddled the knobs on my filter box, and now all of a sudden the thing just seems like it's too loud. Well, that's because it is. And if you go back to the very beginning of your signal chain and take some of that gain away, things will fall back into place.
Next question.
Tim Holm in San Lorenzo, often here on the panel, says, can we have a second-hour lab on compression and expanders?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, so I do an audio class on almost every Monday, and I've gone over this. But you know what? This would be a good after-hours breakout room session to schedule.
Or even just the main room. I mean, I think we're taking into, like, when we schedule a lab, we're just taking the main room, letting people do it. I find that I'm trying not to use the breakout rooms very often. So I'd rather have people just, let's not do it all day, every day, but if we're going to learn something or figure something out, we're going to just do it in the main room. Like I'm going to try to figure something out probably this afternoon. I'll probably just jump into the main room and see if I can't figure it out. Getting ready for tomorrow. We have a basic thing that I want to show tomorrow, but then I thought of something I want to try to figure out. So we'll probably figure it out in after hours. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. He says, Billie Eilish's engineer uses Waves PSE, or primary source expander, to bring her weak voice over the rest of the band. How does it work, and what gain structure issues could it create?
I don't know if any of us... Oh, yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Well, you want to make sure that you never do a duet with Ethel Merman.
There we go. There's the most technical answer we've had. Go ahead, Brian.
I'm going to go out on a limb here. I haven't used the specific Waves PSE, but based on the name of it, I'm guessing that it is an emulation of the Neve 5045 primary source enhancer. Exactly how that works is magic voodoo sauce, to be honest. But it's primarily what it does is sounds that aren't changing much. It minimizes. Sounds that are changing much, it enhances. Primary source enhancement. So things like cymbal wash, which is just sort of shh in the background, it does a pretty good job of minimizing those. Billie Eilish's voice is changing on a millisecond by millisecond basis. Like it's a constant changing source. It tends to enhance those things. The other reason that they get away with it is everyone's on ear monitors, because if Billie Eilish's band was trying to use wedges, she wouldn't tour.
Next question.
Timo Galeos from Austin, Texas. Why is it that with all Google or YouTube resources, they can't get the volume level consistent from one video to the next, requiring you to have the volume control remote or whatever handy? It's more than annoying, Timo says.
They probably ought to have a setting that evens it out, but for the most part, they're leaving it up to the creators. I mean, that's why they're doing that, is to let the creators create the show that they want. A lot of times people using dynamic range to do something, they want it to be quiet and then they want it to be loud. And so for you to take that away from them would be taking away the artistic intent of the video. And so that's probably why they do it. Next, go ahead, Courtney, real quick.
I was just going to ask, I don't know the answer to this, but does when you upload something to YouTube, doesn't they do some type of audio normalization in that?
Not that I know of. No, I don't think they compress it, but they don't process it. Next question.
Cindy in Colorado is our last questioner here today, and she says, I want a better over-the-ear mic for my Rode Go 2 than the DeCapo I am using. Any suggestions for that?
Over-the-ear mic for the Rode Go 2.
Would a Sennheiser work? They're maybe $200.
I think that the Sennheisers might be better. Yeah, it's not quite a... Yeah, I don't... the Sennheisers might give you a better sound. Is there a version of the Countryman or DPAs that will do that? I mean, we're asking for better, so we're, nothing like spending more money on your mic than you spent on your thing, but on your transmitters. But anyway, I think that a lot of us use piles. The piles and the Polsons; those are not necessarily better. I'm not familiar with the one that you're talking about, so I'm not certain whether they would be better or worse than what you have right now. So these are the DeCapo. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that mic, so I can't compare it. But a lot of us have used those. In fact, I'll probably be using. I'll be using one of those for the cooking this weekend. So as a little test here. So we'll play with that. All right, well done. That was a Geek Fest. which is great. Again, the Tuesdays have become like, when it comes to audio, I take it very seriously. Like who's like, as some of the folks here was like, I'm reaching out to people, making sure people are going to show up and making sure like, because the Tuesdays have become this like really deep discussion about things that we want to keep. And we're hoping to do that more with more days. But that's the first day that is, I think, really matured. That and education are the ones that have really matured in that area. So anyway. Great work by the producers asking great questions. Great work by the panelists answering those questions and really giving us a great conversation. So thank you again. And now we're going to move in. Remember, tomorrow we're going to talk about. It really is an exploration of what Isadora does, but hopefully it'll help you understand it a little bit more. We're doing labs on Wednesdays through Fridays at 2:00 every week, most likely, as we come up to speed. But this will give you a little preview of something we discovered. And like I was like, could we do this? And we thought maybe we could. And then we started making one, and then we could. And so it's actually an AV sync built into Isadora, which it's so quick that you could probably build it on site on the free version and just feed stuff into it and go, oh, it works, and I can measure my sync. It's not quite as accurate as a Matchbox, but it's pretty cool. And that's what I'm going to work on this afternoon, is seeing if I can make it really accurate by sampling over time. So we're gonna play with that a little bit. All right, that's it. We're going to jump into after hours. Thanks, everybody.